I sat down with the executive and said, you do know once you take the cost out, you're going to have to clean up the processes. I got a yes, 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 and it never happened. And you can imagine what happened afterwards. The whole thing turned to custard very, very quickly. No big change comes for free.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each of these episodes, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with such a diverse range of process experts, people that have been working in this area of business process management and either helping their own organization internally, or sometimes it's with people that are helping from a consulting perspective or through an academic lens. But it's been such a journey to this point. I think we're into the hundreds of episodes now, 110 or something around about that point. So it's such an educational database of content there. So if this is your first time watching an episode, feel free to go back and flick through all of the other episodes. We try and give clear labels for the headings there, so you're able to get a quick grasp on what the conversation sort of centers around. But in today's episode, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Roger Perry, who is the CEO of Bevington Group, has such a long history of experience in the process space from a consulting perspective. So working with a wide range of organisations, some of Australia's largest organisations. So very excited for this conversation. Roger, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Daniel. Thanks for having me here.
That's great. So, and one thing that our audience loves to find out as we're starting off is how did you find yourself in the process world? Was it by chance? Was it something you studied, or how did you end up here?
Well, I got into the process world really through my early work in technology. So I started, my first job was with Shell Australia, actually, in their computing division.
Right.
And so what we had to do was work out the processes before we designed and built system. That was back in the days when large companies would still build their own systems internally. So I was fascinated with it. And by the time I had left Shell and joined another consultancy, not Bevington, but my first consultancy, I very much adopted the nickname Process Perry, because of where I wanted to generally pay attention and do my work. Not that I minded programming, that was fun too, but it was the process piece that captured my attention. So very much from the early stages of my career, I've been interested in process reengineering.
That's great. And I'd imagine that over the years you've seen the space evolve and change, whether that's new methodologies or new technology. What are some of those more sort of significant changes that you've noticed over the last 10, 20 years?
So I can remember when I was worked for ANZ, where I had a performance management role there. And I can remember there was a re-engineering program happening in mortgages at the time. Now, this is quite a few years ago, so I'm a bit over the look probably, but the reality is that it would take years to map and do the process re-engineering and to figure out what was going on. The tools were clumsy, it was hard to share, the team would turn over, so you get inconsistently applied concepts. Whereas these days, it's actually possible to collect as-is data quickly, to analyze it consistently, to apply actually a global body of knowledge, particularly in and around lean concepts, as well as deeper process re-engineering and some mathematical concepts, and even model out solutions. So that's the first biggest change. It's faster, it's technology enabled, and that gives you enormous benefits. Also, because of the global nature of it, it's possible to compare and contrast yourself with others in your processes, and it's much easier to learn from others. So, for example, at Bevington, we have, I think it's actually Australia's only waste database where you can actually benchmark yourself against waste. But there are other benchmarks around the world which are interesting. So we can tell you, how do you fare against others in waste? And that's pretty different from where it was 15, 20 years ago, because that simply wasn't possible.
Yes.
And finally, I'd say BPM is a big lens into other things. Like for us, it's a big lens into the operating model, which is just how you organize to get things done. So therefore, you're going to absolutely be actively involved in automation and data. It's impossible not to be.
Yeah, and with all of the organisations that you've worked with, what would you say are some of the biggest drivers for an organisation wanting to understand and manage their processes better?
So I think it comes down to three things with some wrinkles. So I'll go with the three things first, and then I'll explain the wrinkles. So certainly cost, but unit cost in particular, because sometimes people will grow but keep the same cost, but it's deployed much more efficiently and effectively. So that unit cost perspective. Followed quickly, and often depending on the state of the market you're in, you often first, customer service. Just getting the job done right first time for the customer to really build your NPS profile. They're actually often related, which we'll come to in a few minutes' time. And last, but definitely not least risk, which is a very, very big subject in the market at the moment. So, but they're all related. So if you can deliver a process with, for example, fewer errors to keep it very, very simple, or clearer communication and a nice, simple customer journey, and the customer journey is kind of the customer flip side of process from an internal perspective, you basically end up with less expensive process. For example, you've got less cost of failure. You've got a happier customer because stuff's not going wrong, and you've got less risk because things aren't going wrong. So all of that can lead to both a reduced cost and higher revenue. But really, why do people call Bevington? It's unit cost. So there is a revenue side to that. There's no question, because there's a revenue associated with the unit. Then you'd say some sort of customer service perspective and risk. They're the main reasons people pick up the phone, and then they discover other things.
Yeah. Okay. So would you say that there is more of a focus on the customer journey as opposed to the internal processes, or would you say organizations tend to focus more internally as opposed to the customer experience? What would you say?
So it varies enormously, is the first.
Yeah.
If people are coming to us with a primary cost perspective, they're often less focused on the customer journey, and we have to sort of get them to focus.
Right.
So if I'm explaining to an organization that hasn't really thought about it first up, that's becoming increasingly rare because people do know about customer journeys. I say, imagine you've got a piece of cardboard, and on one side of the cardboard, you've got your internal process map. On the other side of the cardboard, you've got your customer journey and what the experience is like for your customer. Put a pin through that and you can thread them both together. And they kind of get that as a visual metaphor, and then we can go forward from there. So those who come to us and say, hey, I've got a customer journey issue. I really want to build my customer experience in the right way, or I want to automate it, or I want to do other things in the customer journey, usually with an NPS focus, which is retention, which is increased revenue. Then they'll often start with customer journey. Others will start the other way with process. We tend to take them to both places as far and as fast as we can, because they're so much related. Again, tools, the way tools have changed is nowadays we have many tools which can allow you to pin them together, the process,
right,
the journey map. So it's pretty extraordinary because you can move pretty darn fast.
Yeah, okay. And what would you say are some of the biggest challenges an organisation face when adopting BPM or generating that buy-in for BPM? What will generally sort of hold up that sort of BPM implementation or adoption?
Yeah, it is mostly leadership, really.
Yeah, okay.
So I usually say, look, there are three critical success factors. The first one's definitely leadership. The second one's actually leadership, and the third one's leadership too. So, so the first thing is with leadership is, what are the expectations?
Right.
So, process re-engineering is not a 3-month brutal cost out type thing, and there are actually consultancies in the market that will actually do that for you. And process re-engineering it's something that you do to your business that absolutely makes it more efficient and effective, but it has a sustainable focus. It's about something that actually lasts. So now that being said, there are, particularly of late, leaders who've come with this one example of a particular thinking about that have really had to deal with both the revenue and cost lines incredibly quickly. And there's one that particularly comes from one of the very first ones that we did in the energy sector that encountered a crisis. It had to drop costs 40%. Okay, that has to be done. And we work with them on, therefore, using process re-engineering tools as to what you can stop, but then quickly said, look, if you're going to take out that level of cost, you've broken process and you've got to stitch them back up together. If senior leaders don't know, you've actually got to do the work afterwards to stitch up the process after the cost out, if that's what they want, and they don't always want it, and then we've got a problem. Another example was a very large financial institution. I sat down with the executive and said, you do know once you take the cost out, you're going to have to clean up your processes. I got a yes, 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 and it never happened. And you can imagine what happened afterwards. The whole thing turned custom very, very quickly. Because you break processes if you're taking cost out without actually fixing them. You break it.
Yes.
So that's the first thing. So the first thing is very much what your leaders know and what they expect. They also, number two, have to lean into it and lead from the front. And three, they have to be prepared to invest in it. No big change comes for free. It's not a free good. You have to do the work.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
That's the biggest of two.
Yeah. And I think that it's interesting, depending on the leader's experience of process, that can even either have a negative sort of perception of what process means. Because I have heard a number of times that, oh yeah, we did a process thing. We with all of our processes, we've already done that. It didn't really give us the value that we were looking for, but obviously that was a very narrow lens, or maybe they didn't have a greater purpose or a why. Why are we actually doing this activity? What's the end goal? What are we hoping to achieve? Because sometimes an 18-month mapping exercise, you get to the end of that and the business has moved on and priorities have changed, leadership's moved in and out, and for some people it's like, oh, what is process really going to do for us?
Danny, you've hit on one of my favorites. When we go into an organization, they've spent 2 years mapping stuff, actually not changed anything. It's just a terrible way to start process.
Yes.
Look, process re-engineering is a discipline of change. It's there to make stuff better. If you're a process engineer, your job is to make stuff better, not admire the problem.
Yes, right.
So that's the job. You're actually mapping the process so you understand the problem and can change it. And you're going to pump out a new process map with a whole bunch of changes in it. If it takes you 2 years, doing the job wrong. If it takes you 18 months. So this is a very brutal way to look at it, but in years of experience, you're only going to get the buy-in of the organization if you map, analyze, develop solutions, implement something pretty quickly that shows that this discipline is incredibly powerful. And it is incredibly powerful. So show it. Process mapping is only one part of the overall skill set, which is exceptional BPM capability. Move to the others quickly before you finish process mapping every single tiny thing that the organization does. Pick a value stream, make it rock.
Yes. Yeah.
On that. So you're absolutely right. And that's actually one of the biggest reasons it gets rejected. So, and therefore, many leaders are left with the impression that process business management, so process re-engineering is in effect process mapping. It's much more than that, of course, as we all know. But that's all they get to see, and that really damages its reputation inordinately.
Right.
We quite often have to go in and unpick that mess, which is a mess in people's heads and expectations.
Right. Okay. And obviously, you've worked with many organisations that I'm assuming have picked that core process and made it rock. Do you have a couple of examples of wins where an organisation has, I guess, implemented BPM correctly or well, and it has delivered significant value to the organisation?
Many. So I'll just start with that one that I talked about, where they had to take out 40% cost, and they had to take out 40% of cost and make their enterprise hum pretty much straight afterwards. They did that. They survived an existential threat, and they've gone on to great things, and they've grown maybe 20% of their current size.
Wow.
In the energy sector. Another one is process re-engineering often ends up for us in operating model change. So you see something through the process lens and you see a structure doesn't work, or a policy doesn't work, or a bit of technology doesn't work, or a technology suite doesn't work, because you see a world of organizational challenge through the process lens. It's one of the best lenses to see stuff. And we did that with a listed financial institution, financial enterprise, and effectively it achieved its 3 month. It's achieved in 3 months its 9-month targets.
Wow.
It actually increased revenue, reduced cost, improved NPS, and lifted its share price to almost double its starting point by the time.
Oh my goodness.
And I can go on.
Yeah.
During COVID, a supply chain organization, which had all sorts of challenges with its pricing processes, have been able to do something about that. And it's had a complete reputational change in the market as to how it actually operates. So it can also affect your reputation with your peers in the market. Now, all of these organizations, though, have one thing in common other than Bevington, which is savvy leadership.
Yes.
They pretty much knew what they can do with this thing.
Right.
Doesn't mean they can do it, but they have a rough idea of what they can do with this thing and why it's powerful. So replete with examples, and also in the government sector, where in many cases what we've been able to do is turn something that doesn't work just into something that does actually achieve its effectiveness objectives. It's not just efficiency, it's effectiveness too.
Yeah, okay.
So including things like we've been active in even things like clinics for vaccines, and making sure that the floor layout's appropriate and the flows are appropriate to be able to get things to work. And so you find that you can deploy these methods all over the place. So there's no shortage of success stories. You can sort of name an industry and we can give you a story. And
yes.
You got to give credit to the leaders of those organizations for having done a great job too.
Yeah, definitely. So if there is an organization where maybe they're the leadership isn't on board with the idea of BPM, I mean, we would probably have people listening to this episode right now, when it's released, that that they're thinking, I don't think my leaders get this. I don't think they understand it fully, even if they're in the organization to help with process re-engineering or some form of process work. They still might be thinking like, it's still not really being driven by the top down. How do you go about pitching this to your senior leaders? What sort of language do you need to use?
So interestingly, you've asked some success stories. Basically, what we do is we tell stories because Also, from a consultant perspective, our view is that if you really want to know what's going on, go speak to someone who's done it.
Yes.
So our favorite thing to do is to take an executive team and go look at someone else who's done it. What did they actually experience? Because you may or may not believe your consultant because you think your consultant is a vested interest, and of course your consultant does. But you look through a list of other organizations, you pick a couple that you think might be neat and go have a chat. So we do often spend a lot of time connecting, even if they're not cynical, they might be skeptical, right? Because they've seen process re-engineering fail, and it's actually okay to be skeptical and go and talk to another organization that's been through the pain and got the gain, but importantly, they've been through the pain. They've done the hard. They've done the work. They've done the change management at the end as well. It's not just the technical solution to a set of process problems. To get there. So we think the best thing to do is say, don't believe us. Come and chat to these other folks. And if that's not enough, we'll introduce you to some more.
Yeah, okay. And is that generally cross-industry or same industry, but maybe in a different sort of market? Or
so there are actually 3 ways to do it. One is you go to an organization that's in the same industry. Now you'll have a much more constrained conversation. So if you can find this industry in a different market, that's better. We have a database of those that we use because we have overseas clients as well. That's how we actually address it usually. Or you have a different industry but similar process. So let's just say if you've got some sort of order to cash process. process, or some sort of procure-to-pay process, or some sort of recruitment process, which would be a classic at the moment because a lot of that. It doesn't need to be exactly the same industry. It can be a similar industry. So therefore, you have a much more open conversation because there's no competitive dynamics involved in that. Or the third way is you go to an organization that kind of has the same social or cultural setup, even if it's not exactly the same process or exactly the same industry, because they're concerned that culturally this ain't going to land.
Right.
So how's anyone else actually done this? Because you can design the most fabulous solution in the world, but if you don't actually implement it, it's still a waste of money. So you get all three. And what we do to help people into it, I mentioned we have a waste database. We say, look, we suspect based on where you are, your waste is about X, Y, or Z. And this is how much waste you should be able to address, including waste in people's time, which we call waste. And often they'll go, that seems pretty high, because often it is. Can we speak to someone who's had a similar experience and managed to get it down? Sure. That's probably a combination of those 2 and 3, similar process and similar cultural positioning or concern about the size of the number.
Yeah, okay.
That's how we...
And obviously, like getting buy-in from leadership is one thing, but then also it's working with all stakeholders. So getting the process participants or the process performers to be okay for the change as well. Is that a huge sort of hurdle that organisations face, or how do you tackle that?
Look, it is a very significant hurdle. So we tackle it from the beginning. Now, it depends which method we use. I'll talk about the process reengineering method per se, as opposed to the lean method, because we also use classic lean a lot.
Right.
Let's say it's our particular preferences in our process reengineering style. And we actually speak to the front line, people who are doing the job.
Yeah.
So not just SMEs are often already overstretched anyway and hard to get to because everyone's asking the SME the same question. So we'll go to the front line and actually interview, observe, gather data from people who are actually doing the jobs. And often we actually interview people who are willing, directly or indirectly, to be champions of the change. Now, as our interview process progresses, it becomes obvious to them, based on the way we ask the questions, that they're experiencing noise and waste, that their frustrations are probably to do with noise and waste, that their disappointments at their own customer failures are probably to do with noise and waste, and it's a problem with the structure of the entity or the process or the rule set, not a problem with them as an individual. So it's a bit like the psychiatrist's couch for them. So the psychiatrist's couch, in a process sense, where you've got someone asking you about your work life and they're genuinely interested in your pain and suffering.
Right.
Now that is a human as well as a process connection. That works. So some organizations will, for example, do an observation before they'll do an interview. We never do an observation before an interview, except on extremely constrained circumstances, which we feel is because a lot of this is about trust to make the change happen at the implementation end. So broadly speaking, without waffling on about the change management too much, it starts at the beginning. The first interviews and data collection you have, you're already in the change game. How are you going to do it? How are you going to position it? How are you going to play it? How are you going to engage?
Yeah, right. Now, obviously, over the last 2 years now, it's been a very turbulent time for a lot of organisations, particularly to their processes and the resilience of their processes or the effectiveness of them, and supply chains have changed and transformed, and organisations have been forced to adapt. So it's been a very turbulent 2 years for lots of organisations. Some organisations have thrived with the limitations or restrictions, and they've thought outside the box and worked, how can we do this better? And then other organisations have really struggled. But what does it look like to have governance and have resilient processes in a time like we're in at the moment?
Yeah. So this is where process and then operating model design start to really come together. So a couple of things just generally. So there are some real winners, of course, in all these changes. So Australian manufacturing, there are many manufacturers who are doing just fine, thank you very much.
True.
as long as they can keep their staff in the factory, and there are all sorts of things that are emerging there. So, for example, this is an example of resilient process creating sales in a manufacturing center so that one group's not going to infect the other if there was an outbreak at the production facility. And that actually requires new flows and new processes. In those flows and processes, you might have triggers as to whether there's a problem. So you've got new flows at the production plant, but you might also have new flows in the way you make decisions. And this is some of the biggest changes. So often organizations have had to make decisions much, much faster. And that has meant that they have developed and deployed different decision-making processes. And some of them are going back to the old processes and are starting to do that now, if they haven't already done. Others are going, do you know, that kind of worked? And often they're processes which empower staff, and they're mission-directed leadership processes. So what I mean by that, mission-directed leadership is an idea where you actually train people, literally train people to make decisions based on a set of guidelines. And because they're trained to make decisions, those actually at the front line are empowered because they're properly trained, not just thrown out to sort of fend for themselves, but properly trained. And the processes in decision making make it clear what you can decide, what you can't decide, what's a guideline, what's a rule, how you capture the process, how you deploy that process, how your decisions get measured, and it all kind of wraps into a decision making cultural and process bubble. Those organizations have done very well, and we know from the research, and we know categorically from COVID, that enterprises that have actually managed to do distributed leadership well, particularly where there are different rules in different markets, we've had in Australia with different states, have been able to be very adaptive at a local level, which has given them an extraordinarily good piece of competitive advantage.
Yes, yeah, definitely, I can imagine. And then obviously, training and learning is another huge element to ensure that the organisations are well equipped and everyone's on the same page, and there is adequate sort of upskilling necessary or delivered to the right people at the right time. So how does an organisation prepare for that?
So, look, it's a great question, because particularly at the moment, there is a shortage of capable skill sets in Australia to manage the quantum of change that organizations want to deliver. So particularly as we've had closed borders, we used to be able to get expertise from overseas to be able to either train people that it might be in automation, it might be training BAs, it might be doing processes, it might be doing data analytics, it might be doing cybersecurity, of course, which is another incredibly hot area, and there's an overlap with that on process as well, but that'd be an entirely new podcast, I think, on that. But in essence, so there is a shortage, so training becomes really important. What's happened for us is organizations have started to actually get us to train BAs. And because of our particular bent, we've done two components. There's like a BA bootcamp, which is for new BAs, where we go, right, here's what it means to be a BA, particularly on a large technology-related program, as opposed to an operations business analyst, which is often examining the business day-to-day and doing a somewhat different thing. And then we roll from there straight into deep process training. Now that works very, very well, because process is like an uber skill, because if you can do the process bit, then you can understand how what could be automated. You understand how to fit in the processes through to automation. You know how data flows through a system, but also how data and people interact, because you're the BA doing the process bit. You know who interacts with whom when. You know what information is passed between people and systems when. You know what controls are in place and how. You know what reporting happens in and around those controls and those flows. You know where the bottlenecks, you know where the pain points are. And that process gives you a lens to be able to do all of that and so much more. Very importantly, to actually capture requirements and write them down and express them pictorially as well as in words and tables.
Right.
Now, all of that is a skill there just isn't enough of. Australia's critically short of all of that. So there are two types of training, therefore, broadly for us. That kind of BA process and skill set training. And training and coaching is absolutely essential. Training by itself is of limited value because it is a skill developed in practice.
Right, right.
Learning principles. So just doing a course without the practice doesn't work that well. It just doesn't stick. So when Bevington trains, we always train with a practice coaching component so you can stick, and then we'll only accredit basically after you've practiced. You can get a certificate for the course, but accreditation is after you've done some practice. Now that's very important and more and more common. What's driving a lot of organizations to do that is basically they want to change, and COVID's shown them they have to change. There's a shortage of people, so they're taking their good staff and starting to train them in these BA and process roles, which is smart thinking, great career development for those people. Now, the other bit of training is just people who actually work in the processes. And we often recommend that any good organization should have broad-based lean. So basically, we actually think that any team leader and above should understand enough of lean to see waste and have a pretty good idea as to how to collaborate.
Right.
Which is actually process thinking.
Yes.
They should understand flow, they should understand waste, they should understand customer value, and that's the basis of many concepts that are being deployed in process reengineering. I mean, lean and process reengineering have become merged into one big family.
Right.
That broad-based training is incredibly important. And in some of those examples that I talked about, one of the features there is a great internal BA and process team and a good broad knowledge of what waste is and where it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. No, that's great. And like obviously these are some fundamentals or that organizations should be giving some attention to or focus to when in terms of upskilling or training their employees, their workforce. But when you look at the future of BPM, and obviously over the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of change, especially when it comes to technology, and you know, I feel like we've gone through different waves of different technology that it's, you know, a lot of it's still around, but they go through different sort of hype cycles, if you wanted to call it that, whether that's RA or RPA or process mining or these different technologies. But when you look at the future of BPM, what sort of trends are you noticing, and where do you feel organizations should really be focusing their time, effort, and energy?
So in BPA, some things remain the same and have done for the last 20 years. BPM, you are fundamentally designing processes which make it appropriate and effective for people and machines, software or hardware, and interact effectively. That bit remains effectively the same. But what's happening with BPM is it's actually becoming considerably more sophisticated. So the tools to do the BPM are sophisticated. The interaction with various forms of automation, and yep, absolutely RPA, but core on platform automation, right? So what's happening as major software providers rolling out is also interacting with other forms of technology enablement. So what we're doing now, so there may be processes, for example, for a bank, which are different if you meet face-to-face than if you actually do some sort of video conferencing. There may be processes for large mental health institutions, which we also do a lot of work in, where things are a little bit different. They must be done a little bit differently on screen. That's a technology interaction. The interaction between process data, measurement, and collaboration tools, of which this is one, but it's only one form of collaboration tool, has become incredibly important. And the interaction between process and ways of working. So what are the processes if you're in a hybrid organization versus an office organization? What are the processes if you're introducing Agile as a core way of doing business, not just for projects, but for the way you actually do your normal business? What actually happens to those processes? So what's happening with process reengineering? It's becoming an umbrella discipline for people who understand a lot of all the other stuff that's going on that enable organizations. Because actually processes are the glue by which you stick it all together in your operating model. So they're becoming, in effect, deep designers to allow multiple technologies and people and practices to interact highly effectively. So that's really the future of BPM as an umbrella discipline that allows you to deploy so much modern goodness.
That's great. That's really good. And obviously in this conversation in 30 or so minutes, we can only sort of squeeze very little into the conversation, and we've only been able to touch on sort of a very high level of a number of these different topics that, there is so much more to it than it's a lot easier to sort of mention and talk about it than it is to actually implement or action a lot of these sort of ideas and topics. But for the audience that is listening, and maybe for some of them, and one of the goals of this podcast is that these conversations would really spark questions, challenge mindsets, and get people to start thinking about the way that their organisation is tackling this topic of business process management. But for someone that maybe you have left them with a few more questions around how they're actually currently going about it, how can that person sort of keep in touch with you and your journey and the work that you're doing? Because I think, if someone's really connected with you over this conversation, it only makes sense for them to sort of continue that conversation, or at least follow you on some sort of platform like LinkedIn to keep up to date with the work that you're doing.
They can certainly connect with Bevington Group on LinkedIn, or even connect with me. On the Bevington website, there's access to webinars that people can join. There's even one coming up on Friday, where we talk about topics du jour and that are of particular interest at this point in time. So they can do that. And I'd also recommend that they developed, if they're really going to stay in the space, something of a broader interest, which if they connect into the Bevington webinars, they'll see, like, for example, the American Association for Manufacturing Excellence, for example, has a huge array of tools and capabilities and practices that are completely valuable in this space. And there's an Australian version of that too. So there are places to go that you can look. But also, if I was new in process reengineering, I'd be thinking about the sort of sister twin brother skills that might be useful. And one of the most important of those is statistics. So having a really good statistical brain for process reengineering in particular is very valuable. It's also valuable for things like data analytics.
Yeah, great. That's amazing. Well, Roger, I just want to thank you so much for sitting down with me today. I've certainly been taking a lot of notes and gleaning a lot from this conversation, and I'm sure our audience will have gleaned a lot from this conversation as well. So on behalf of the Process Pioneers community, thanks for having this chat with me today.
It's a pleasure, Daniel, and it's been lovely to meet you. Thank you very much.